Good. Good. So it is just a couple of minutes before the hour, wherever you are. And I'm very happy to welcome you back to our last formal paper session of this two-day conference. My name is Alex Rehding, and it's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, first of all, of course, to Nina and Danny and all the workers behind the scenes who've made this Zoom conference, this worldwide event, such a successful conference. And we are now in the trajectory of this conference in the process of winding up it. I mean this in more sense than one, because this is a conference on metaphors. And so in the sense of higher and higher, that is quite important here. After the previous session, which was entitled More Than Metaphors, we are now in the land of concepts, with or without a T. And those of you who've wondered what the title might mean when you read it, when you maybe thought there is a typo in there, all I can say is it's not a typo. It's meant to be that way. The final paper session is both a turn toward greater abstraction, and at the same time, it's a move toward greater concreteness. Our first paper, a keynote by Holly Watkins, turns our attention to her garden. And she considers both plants and fungi as they influence her thinking about music. And we then will have a paper by William Echard, who turns the metaphoric vice up one notch in his reflections on literalness and imaginative transfer. And our session is then rounded off by Jeff Kaiser, who presents us with 4 types of metaphors in writing about contemporary music from the last years from the book series Arcana. Each paper, as before, will be 10 minutes long, and that gives us a little bit of time for some final discussion. And that will then lead into the final plenary discussion. And what I can do for now is to wish us all a wonderful session. And our first paper will be the keynote by Holly Watkins, entitled Turn and Return, Listening and Thinking in Concepts. Over to you, Holly.
Thanks very much, Alex. And thanks to Nina and Daniel and everyone else who was involved in planning this. I know how hard it is to plan a conference and to pull it off. So in a mere few minutes, you guys can breathe a sigh of relief. Why does Western philosophy's quest for the foundations of knowledge so rarely begin from the ground beneath us? Since becoming an avid gardener a couple of years ago, I have returned again and again to this question, and I find myself chasing after an old dream, the dream of thinking that would be doing, of a life in which thinking and doing would not feel like such disconnected activities. As the biologist and educator Craig Holdridge has written, quote, "If we did not perceive the profound disconnect between the workings of nature and human thinking and action, we wouldn't be asking how we can inhabit the planet in a more sustainable way," end quote. Holdridge targets Western object thinking as the chief culprit, the kind of thinking that treats things as separate from each other and from us. Object thinking trades in concepts, which subsume individuals to categories and impose boundaries where a fuzzier reality pertains. The violence of concepts is revealed by their etymology. Concept, from the Latin concipere, is related to capere, to take or grasp. Holdridge combats object thinking with what he calls thinking like a plant, with mental strategies that honor the ecological relations in which all beings are embedded. Today, I'm going to try thinking like a fungus, thinking, that is, with concepts, no T, a neologism that takes its root not from capere, but from sippus, meaning stake or post, a root that in turn spawns the word sep, or mushroom. The concept with no T resembles metaphor in that it joins together disparate realms of sensation, perception, and cognition. Yet it is also contingent and biographical, joining the thinker, the process of thinking, and the world in which both reside. Despite the best efforts of philosophers such as Hegel and Adorno, The concept with a T still implies stasis and stability. By contrast, the concept with no T marks a location along the worldly path of thought as it unfolds in and through particular places and bodies. Concepts, no T, spring up where sensation, perception, and language converge in ways that create memorials to past experience and pointers for future thought and action. Thinking in concepts, the twists and turns of thought arise out of and return to the more than human world in a practice resembling what Potawatomi biologist and writer Robin Wall Kimmerer calls foray and metaphore, observant excursions into the natural world, followed by reciprocal acts of linguistic invention. My captivation with rethinking the ground and regrounding thought dovetails in certain respects, not only with Kimmerer's work, but also with Giorgio Agamben's recent call for a philosophy that would be, quote, a reformation of music, end quote. With music signifying the musaic connection between words and things, allegedly enjoyed by ancient poets in touch with their muses. According to Agamben's What is Philosophy of 2016, musaic philosophy attempts to speak words that come directly from being, miraculously overcoming the distance language seems to impose between humans and the world and their own animality. Part vehicle of logos, part emanation of the animal voice, singing serves Agamben as the emblem of musaic philosophy, because singing, in Agamben's words, quote, celebrates and laments an impossibility of saying, of accessing the event of the word that constitutes humans as humans, end quote. However, in rhythmically returning to the origin of language and turning away from it empty-handed, musaic philosophy can do little more than compose what Agamben, following Plato, calls proems, preludes to discourse that tend the flame of language's connection to the sensible world via the power of naming. Ultimately, Agamben suggests, language comes closest to the world when it can no longer name its own means of action, when it hovers in the desire to make the world sayable. What Agamben doesn't explore, which is ironic given the musical impetus of his argument, is that when language falls silent, the opportunity to listen arises. And so, since Agamben leaves us unsure of how to find the words that come from being, let us try instead to listen for what Kimmerer calls the grammar of animacy. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass of 2013, Kimmerer describes an episode of intentional listening while seated in a pine forest, presumably on the ancestral Haudenosaunee lands where she and I both reside. Quieting the voice in her head, Kimmerer turns her attention to, quote, the voices outside it, the shh of wind in the needles, water trickling over rock, nuthatch tapping, chipmunks digging, and something more, something that is not me, for which we have no language, the wordless being of others in which we are never alone, end quote. I am struck by the way that listening helps Kimmerer open herself to aspects of the living world that cannot be named, and even those that cannot be heard at all. What she hears instead in this moment is the echo in Anishinaabe language of what goes unheard in the natural world. Recounting her discovery of the word pupawi in a book of ethnobotany, Kimmerer describes her mounting fascination with the people who had invented a word for, quote, the force which causes mushrooms to push up from the earth overnight, end quote. She marvels, quote, the makers of this word understood a world full of being, full of unseen energies that animate everything, end quote. Pupawi became in turn what Kimmerer denotes a signpost, a marker of the moment when the call of a lost heritage set her on the path of learning the language and ways of the Potawatomi and other indigenous tribes. In this instance, signpost and mushroom, sipus and sep, converge in a way I find irresistible, generating a concept, noti, in which listening, as both literal practice and figure, for intuitive engagement with the natural world, available to those potentially with differing abilities, shifts the very steps Kimmerer takes toward renewing earthly communities. Perhaps the musical reformation of philosophy could start here, with a hearing that is also a hearing, or more broadly, with expanding one's responsiveness to the voices of human and non-human others, and with learning to feel through multiple sensory or intuitive modalities, the something more that flows through both. In this spirit, several weeks ago, I started my own intentional listening practice, in which I followed my dogs outside in the early morning, opened my ears, and with difficulty, cleared mental space for attention to the world, and even perhaps to the words that come from being. Most mornings, the living soundscape is dominated by birds. Crows, blue jays, mourning doves, wrens, titmice, geese, the occasional gobbling turkey, though there is also the sound of wind in the trees, distant traffic, a passing school bus. One morning, I hear chickadees first, then a strident robin, the first I've noticed this spring, warming up in the oak tree. Cardinals, jays, and titmice are calling. A flock of starlings moves west, chittering to one another as they hold formation. A pair of geese flies in the other direction, one of them honking away. The cronk, cronk, cronk of a crow, the elated call of a pileated woodpecker, followed by the heavy hammering of its search for insects. The antiphonal reply of a downy seeking its breakfast, its percussive strike, flap, flap, flapping in comparison to the pileated thud, thud, thudding. There are too many sounds to think about them all. Returning to the world in intentional listening means being with what is present and waiting for what will present. And so I shift my attention away from thoughts and toward the avian creatures with whom I share space and to whom I feel accountable. Unpredictably, a concept springs to mind that tethers their calls to my response, a concept that has become a signpost along my own path of experience: responsibility. What arose in this moment was not so much a metaphor, but a turn within the name or word itself, a fusion of bird call with the feeling of being called, humanistic civilitas with more than human community. If March was a good month for waiting, then April is a month for doing. If I have heard the words that come from being, they say, it's time to plant. As I pull out weeds, turn in composted manure, and nestle seeds into the soil, I set myself once again on the path to thinking that would be doing, to ideas that get as dirty as my hands, my clothes, my tools. Ideas that spring up out of my embodied and placed life. Ideas as concepts, part stake along a path, part mushroom driven up by an unseen force. Ideas whose sensuous and contingent origins are not erased, whose belonging in a process of thought is not effaced. Thinking that would be doing would be like what Holdridge describes as mental activity that remains aware of its place in the larger relational reality of the earth and its more than human inhabitants. A kind of thinking that safeguards the thriving of what is not thought, that keeps language close to what feeds it in perception, that assesses its impact on the world in which it unfolds, that offers something up to the earth in return for what makes it possible. This would be a kind of thinking truly worth waiting for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was fantastic. Our second speaker is William Echard with a talk entitled Taking Metaphor Up a Notch, Some Ways of Being Literal. Over to you, William.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right? I'm audible? Great.
Yeah.
I'll start with a short 10-minute presentation acknowledgement and just say that I'm speaking to you today from Ottawa, Ontario, which is located in the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Oh, wait, sorry. It will stop other participants. Yes, that's fine. Okay, is everybody seeing that? Great. My own engagement with metaphor goes back to the mid-90s, when I thought a lot about how conceptual metaphor theory might be used to bridge the gap between semiotic theories that had arisen around Western art musics and popular musics. For me at that time, this was a way to challenge both the elitism of the art music tradition and the suspicion towards aesthetic experience found in much popular music studies. Cognitive metaphor theory also seemed to offer a way to lessen the distance between the roles of scholar and fan. In challenging so many frameworks at once, it felt empowering and oppositional. And so in recent years, I've been very interested to see the emergence of a new wave of work on metaphor as a tool for challenging entrenched power structures. But as I've been thinking again about metaphor in this new climate, there are two features of metaphor which strike me as both important and under-addressed. These two features are somewhat distinct, but also related, in that both of them have to do with how we think about the relationship between the metaphorical and the literal, and how that relationship affects metaphor's capacity to challenge hegemonies. And one thing I'll say is this paper is sort of a personal paper in a strange way. It's very abstract, but it really is me coming to grips with a few questions that have been bothering me on a personal level. I've been interested in this whole symposium to see how many of the same issues and tensions are being thought through by other people. And so although in the one sense, this paper is in a bit of a vacuum, in the other sense, I'm very interested in the way that it bridges between things that obviously other people have been saying this weekend. So one of these two features I want to focus on is what I'm calling the danger of latent absolutism. This is the idea that metaphors might, by virtue of their basic structure, undermine their own capacity to be oppositional. The other feature is something I'll call literalization. This relates to an experience I've often had while reading authors who employ striking metaphors and who then make the additional move of taking the metaphor literally. I often find these moments to be the most exciting and empowering examples of metaphor use, but I'm also struck by the way such a move seems to undermine the basic premise of metaphor, that it is non-literal. These two ideas are fairly new to me, so this presentation I'll be discussing preliminary steps in sorting them out. Metaphor is potentially oppositional because, by definition, a striking metaphor makes connections and suggests ways of being which are not fully allowed by currently dominant worldviews, or at least those that are dominant in the headspace of the person who finds the metaphor striking, right? But isn't this oppositional potential self-limiting? Insofar as, while a metaphor remains a metaphor, it needs to presume the priority and fixity of the very conceptual territories it challenges. Most accounts of metaphor assume a concept of literality, or at least a backdrop of relatively fixed differences against which metaphor can operate. And just a few specific examples of this. Sorry, that didn't come through there. So in traditional literary and rhetorical definitions, obviously metaphor by definition is a non-literal, it relies on the literal, non-literal distinction. Even much more highly theorized forms of metaphoric discourse analysis, for example, Foss's very influential approach to it, metaphor is still generally defined as non-literal comparison. Conceptual metaphor theory is one example of a somewhat different approach, somewhat more fluid, but still the normative regularities in embodied experience in which the whole theory of image schemas, which underscores conceptual metaphor theory, is based, is a normative, somewhat literalist kind of view of embodied experience. I think a general question arises from this: to what extent does the use of metaphor entail a commitment to the very sorts of literality it seeks to challenge? Can metaphor ever be used without at the same time reinscribing possibly problematic absolutes? In response to this quandary, one possible course of action relates to the feeling I described earlier, that metaphor is strongest at moments when we make the leap into literality. This idea first crystallized for me recently when I was rereading Suzanne Cusick's classic essay on a lesbian relationship with music in order to teach it in the grad seminar. It seemed to me that her argument became most powerful when she literalized her core metaphor as follows. And I know for most of you this is a reminder, but reminders aren't always a bad thing. So near the end of the essay, Cusick arrives at this: what if music is sex? If sex is free of the association with reproduction, if it is then only a means of negotiating power and intimacy through the circulation of pleasure, what's to prevent music from being sex, and thus an ancient, half-sanctioned form of escape from the constraints of the phallic economy? When I reflect on the effectiveness of this move, I see the similarity to other metaphor-based arguments that have grabbed me over the years. For example, the shift that was so essential in founding ethnomusicology and musical sociology, from viewing music as a mirror of society to viewing it as a site through which social forms are actively constituted, begins to seem like the literalization of a metaphor. I also became aware that I had used the strategy myself without fully thinking it out. For example, in an article on psychedelic music and environmental unconscious, I argued that the virtual spaces and forces experienced in music, which can be interpreted as conceptual metaphors, are not just like an environment, but in fact are an environment. Beyond musical examples, certain recent developments in cultural theory and philosophy also hinge upon literalizing metaphors. For example, consider the pan-experientialism central to some kinds of speculative realism and actor network theory, where a key move is to argue that inanimate objects have experiences in a literal sense, not just metaphorically. Stephen Shaviro describes the move like this. I think that vital materialism and object-oriented ontology both entail some sort of pan-experientialism or panpsychism. We must at least be open to the prospect that having experience is already intrinsic to all existing actual entities. While literalization then can be exciting and highly productive, it also carries risks. Possibly most important, what happens to political and ethical interventions that rely on widely agreed principles and shared facts if we use metaphors in ways that make the real so changeable? Even without the extra idea of literalization, critiques along these lines have been made against metaphor, following the line that overly broad uses of metaphor are dangerous because of how they can impede actions or points of view that are ethically preferable. When I wrote the paper, I picked two examples that I'll give now, but obviously the previous panel unpacked exactly these questions in a lot more nuance and detail. So these examples are not necessary if you were at that panel, but if you weren't, it can't hurt. One example of this kind of critique came up in a colloquium recently given by Jonathan Stern. Regarding the widespread use of the phrase hearing loss, Stern characterized the phrase as only metaphorical because it obscures the fact that the situation being described is not marked only by loss. For example, other senses might be heightened. The word metaphor in this case was critical in a technical sense, but also pejorative in a broadly affective sense, as if metaphor itself is an intrinsically suspect category. In a similar vein, metaphor is sometimes regarded as suspect insofar as it might become a substitute for real action under urgent circumstances. For example, Tuck and Yang's influential argument that decolonization is not a metaphor, which again was discussed in detail in the previous panels. Maybe I don't need to reread that one right now because we just went through it, many of us. There's at least one thing in common between critiques like these and my own excitement about literalization, and it's that tension that's kind of motivating this meditation. I'm very excited about literalization, but I'm also convinced by these reservations about metaphor as perhaps derailing other kinds of ethically important conceptualization. But what these two streams have in common is the conviction not only that metaphors are important, but that their main promise and danger lie in what they do to our always changeable sense of the real. So to zoom out again, one strategy for dealing with the danger of latent absolutism is literalization. That might be considered the most ontologically extreme option. If we tried to map a broader range of possible strategies, what might that look like? As I said earlier, this is still new territory for me. So this map that follows is kind of a preliminary sketch of my own attempt to think through some of the range of possible stances that you might take to this tension within the nature of metaphor. One approach, you could just retain the existing literalized frameworks that support metaphor, right? I see two versions of this. One of them is rooted in a desire to root ethics and politics in some kind of normative foundation. And then in that case, you would just continue to treat metaphor as secondary and suspect, just a metaphor, metaphorization as a problematic act, right? Another version of this, which might be motivated by a desire to minimize the impact of normativity and essentialism, while still maintaining the kinds of frameworks that make metaphor metaphorical. You could prioritize metaphor as a way of keeping epistemologies fluid and potentially inclusive, but without literalizing it, right? The oppositional potential is first strategy. Very strong moral claims can be made where needed, but you're still stuck in absolutism, right? It's once you imply some kind of realness, the absolutism is there, and I think problematic. In version B, difficulties of extreme relativism are avoided and epistemological flexibility is retained, but existing ontologies aren't challenged, right? Another family of approaches simply reject the literal, non-literal distinction, right? We have no shortage of examples of this. Metaphor becomes fully normalized, but also difficult to distinguish from other forms of conceptualization, right? The oppositional potential of this, you provide maximum flexibility and range for play, but you're also forgoing major potential support for ethical and moral positions, right? Another approach, since conceptual metaphor theory has been central to my own work, I wanted to sort of include it in this range of strategies. Under one viewpoint, conceptual metaphor theory is just a version of strategy A. You just retain literal frameworks, right? But there is a more subtle interpretation of it, which I'm calling bounded literalization. Since image schemas are understood as literally existent, any cross-domain mapping based on them can be regarded as grounded in something literal while still being figurative. Whether that's an unforgivable fudge or actually a useful compromise is an interesting question. It provides resources for empowering and literalizing metaphors while retaining a parsimonious ontology. Okay, I'd like to wrap up with just a few quick remarks about why all this is of special interest to me in the case of music, or at least in the case of the particular musical traditions that I know best. The strong links between music and metaphor in general obviously have been widely discussed for centuries in Western traditions. What I think might be fresher, or at least feels fresh to me and worth exploring, is the idea that music is commonly a site for the literalization of metaphor as a different kind of process. It can often be difficult to hear music in a way other than its movement and mood. And the metaphors through which music is described often feel apt in ways that go beyond simple recognition of a few shared features. I think it could be fruitful to give more thought to the question of whether music and the literalization of metaphor have a deep and special relationship to one another. And I'll just finish by saying it was very interesting to me to see the way this exact idea came up in connection with modern versions of conceptual metaphor theory in the previous panel. But of course, its situation in that panel also highlights the way in which there's interesting ethical and moral tensions between that move to literalize metaphor on the one hand, but then concerns about the problems of metaphor on the other. So that's the tension that's kind of motivated me today. And there's a few of the things that I cited. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing now.
Great, thank you so much. Well, that was terrific. And we have our final speaker, Jeff Kaiser. And now I have to find the title. Here we go. There it is. Arcana and Metaphor, Value, Poetry, Myth, and Ideology. Thanks so much. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you all very much. So as we know, this is all about people employ metaphors to communicate what they perceive to be meaningful, powerful, and valuable about music. Beyond the provocative and poetic resonances of specific metaphors, are there ways in which metaphor usage in a given musical community can offer insight into their values and practices? I am particularly interested in whether contemporary musicians invent new metaphors to convey their thoughts and intentions in new ways in which metaphors may reflect and even promulgate certain ideological positions and assumptions, and ways metaphors provide insight into the frequently encountered themes of transcendence, spirituality, and mythology in discussions of music. This paper came about through my desire to examine the language of a group of musicians looking for common themes and figures of speech, metaphor being a commonly employed trope, but undoubtedly play a part. As Lakoff and Johnson write, it is unavoidable, ubiquitous, and mostly unconscious. I chose Arcana, noting that it is rich with metaphors. Even the title evokes metaphorical thinking as it refers to something hidden, secrets, mysteries, alchemists, and classifications within a pack of tarot card. So Arcana is a book series containing essays by people involved with contemporary music, performers, composers, academics, producers, engineers, and more. Edited by John Zorn, the first volume was published in 2000, with the 10th and final volume published in 2021. They feature essays ranging from academic, personal, and poetic reflections, political, philosophical, and aesthetic treatises, travelogues, social and spiritual aspects of music making, polemics for and against technology, music and film, music and dance, and many, many, many metaphors, all combining to make Arcana a valuable and large data set providing insight into the past few decades of creative music practice. Armed with paper books and highlighters, at first I would pore over the texts, typing into my word processor as if I were some sort of metaphor accountant. I used FileMaker Pro to create a relational database that allowed for robust filtering and search features. As the Arcana volumes kept being produced, though, the time-consuming method of close reading became a challenge. I added computational tools for textual analysis that would facilitate a time-efficient model for finding metaphors. I begin with Voyant tools And even with simple word counts, you can see where themes are starting to emerge. I then moved on to Lexos, and finally I've been using Mallet, which is a machine learning for language toolkit. I also had to decide which metaphor theory was meaningful to me and useful to my research and avoid being intimidated by what Raymond Gibbs called, quote, a number of contenders for the best metaphor theory contest, end quote. I chose conceptual metaphor as well as the previous speaker, brought into prominence by Lakoff and Johnson. That is the understanding of one conceptual domain in terms of a different conceptual domain. An example of a common conceptual metaphor in music is physical structure, where target domain music is understood by the group of knowledge and experience represented by the source domain physical structure. An example is Myra Melford's use of space, structure, and within in her Arcana essay, which is, quote, to create an aural space that is not only structurally and aesthetically satisfying, but that also allows for the individual listener or player within it to have her own experience, end quote. I noticed metaphor recurrence and patterns in Arcana for which I created categories. These are not fixed categories, nor are they prescriptive taxonomies, as a metaphor might have aspects that could be examined in all of the categories. These four categories are ideological, mythological, transcendent symbolic, and poetic creative. For ideological use of metaphor in Arcana, I looked for an emotional appeal to others based on deeply felt patterns of experience and the view that what is being appealed is inevitable and natural. I also looked for tensions or conflicts and iconographic reference. Tension is expressed when the author has a strongly felt position that is not held or supported by someone else, frequently driven by an affiliation with a political stance or aesthetic belief. For example, musicians with a pro-market capitalist ideology might expect musicians to earn a living only from sales and performance income. Buzz Osborne of the rock band The Melvins provides a metaphor-rich example, a lengthy metaphor-rich example of this tension through the conceptual metaphor, art grants our welfare. Quote, the musical world I inhabit is considered slumming for most of the artists I've encountered. This condescending bullshit from these creeps comes across clearly and immediately. It's insulting. One of the most disturbing things I've discovered in my travels is this parasitic art welfare system that permeates every crappy modern art museum in the entire world. In my opinion, it does more harm than good by supporting an army of talentless quacks living maggot life off a private and government-funded system that feeds itself on self-congratulatory lies. As long as the artist blows enough smoke up the right asses, they are handsomely rewarded for their radiant ineptitude with cash and recognition through prestigious placement of their dull scribblings in multi-million-dollar facilities worldwide, end quote. Some authors use mythology as a source domain for their ideas of music, implying a mythological relationship between music and musician. David Punter argues that myth and metaphor aid us in living in a world of complexity by, quote, enabling us to relate our dreams and experiences to a metaphorical backdrop, without which we would be reduced to a series of unrelated events and phenomena. Metaphor is the way in which we bind things together. In Arcana, authors use imagination and rationality in combination with metaphor to reference past myths and construct new mythologies. Imagination, views of myth and creativity, all can be dismissed by academic rationality and vice versa. But as Lakoff and Johnson argue, the reason we have focused so much on metaphor is that it unites reason and imagination. Metaphor is imaginative rationality. Musicians also draw on imagery and language common to religion and ideas of transcendence. Even in academics, we see this. Scholar and musician George Lewis wrote in his book on the AACM, quote, for me, my work together with Braxton achieves a rare commonality of intent based on empathy that the scholar in me is reluctantly obliged to call transcendent. And, quote, jazz, like any music, all posturing by pan-European high culture aside, is founded on soul-infused bodies, end quote. The use of the terms transcendent and soul has a rich history among musicians that is invoked by the use of such metaphors. I group these under the term transcendent symbolic metaphors, meaning metaphors that the authors employ to communicate a special experiential relationship, experiential knowledge through the use of the working terminology of various traditions of religion, mysticism, secular ecstasy, and more. It seems musicians use these TSMs because they believe such metaphors communicate a special relationship to a powerful value that can easily be understood by their audience and point to source domains that the authors see as equally ineffable as the target domain of music. This is to understand music in terms of a highest or most powerful value. Referencing ideas of supernatural powers that combine mythology, iconographic reference, and TSM with the conceptual metaphor, musician as shaman, guitarist Mark Ribot writes, quote, "The musician is both sacrificial victim and magical protector who filters the dangerous volume levels through their bodies, literally standing between the amp and the audience to protect their audience. This ritual is not unlike the shamanistic practice of filtering strong poisons through the bodies so others can enjoy the less toxic residue by drinking their hallucinogenic piss," end quote. New or creative metaphors have a tendency to be noteworthy by virtue of their frequently anomalous character. Metaphors that are less clear and do not draw on culture and embodied experience as part of the reader, thus creating a prolonged contemplation of the meaning of that metaphor. As outlined by Kovacic, possible ways to transform conventional or create new metaphors include extending, elaboration, questioning, combining, personification, and image mapping. For music, I personally would add sound mapping to this list, where one sound is mapped onto another. All of these techniques are used by the authors in the Arcana series to a thought-provoking extent, such as composer Kodoist Mia Masaoki's theriomorphic sound mapping, quote, "My Kodo monster was given yet another way in which to sing, scream, whine, and bellow," end quote. At the beginning of the paper, I asked, are there ways in which aspects of metaphor usage in a given community can offer insight into that community's values and practices? After the study of creative metaphors in the Arcana series and the ubiquity of metaphor in general, I would conclude the answer is an irrefutable yes. Many of these authors, I am certain, would agree with composer, performer Anthony Coleman, who wrote in Arcana, quote, "One reason I am a musician comes out of a negative, my distrust of spoken, written language's ability to express whatever it is I want to say," end quote. But in the midst of this distrust of language, the musicians themselves present a creative, compelling, and expressive use of metaphor. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We had 3 wonderful papers, and we still have a little bit of time for further discussion. Use your hand raise signal if you have a question, or put it in the chat. And while people are still gathering their thoughts, maybe I can kick us off with a question for Holly, because you had this beautiful image of working in the garden and digging in the garden, and that reminded me of something that was often said during my time as an undergraduate. The metaphor of getting your hands dirty was heard almost all the time, but it had a very specific meaning at the time. And getting your hands dirty meant doing really nitty-gritty, very detailed analysis, and kind of working through the score of very difficult works of Western art music. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this. And so I found it quite liberating to hear you use that image kind of turned against itself in a very different kind of way. And I'm just curious to hear a little more about this.
That's a really interesting comment. I hadn't actually thought of that, oddly. That's a phrase. You really have to get your hands dirty. You're digging into material in a really serious kind of way. I mean, and I guess it's just kind of interesting to think of that being compared to the kind of work that we have to do in the earth to make something come forth, right? We don't usually just get our hands dirty. I mean, when we're kids, we get our hands dirty and maybe I get my hands dirty for fun. That's possible. But I think it is about, it's the first step to doing something generative, right? We can't just stay distanced from what we want to happen. We have to be in there. And I think for me, that whole sense of partnership actually is really something to think about. Stuff, or there's earth, there's ground, and there's you. And there has to be some kind of relation for anything generative to happen. So, I mean, I could say a lot more about that, I think, but I'll just try to.
Yeah. No, thanks so much. And maybe, I mean, I had so many thoughts, but on everybody's papers, but maybe I can sort of move Jeff and Will together, because I felt in some ways you came to similar questions from opposite ends almost. I mean, you know, obviously the kind of music and sex image that you brought up, and the literalization idea seems so interesting, because one of the things that we always have to do, and I mean, I don't really need to spell this out at the end of a 2-day conference on music and metaphors, that, you know, there are certain aspects that work for the metaphor and certain aspects that don't work. So when we say, you know, Caesar is a lion, you know, we think that, you know, he's brave and he is, you know, majestic, but we're not supposed to think that he's sort of orange or flea ridden. And most of the time we're really good at, you know, figuring out which aspects are relevant and which aspects are not relevant. But we always have to negotiate it, right? I mean, it's always part way between, you know, a reality and not a reality.
Right.
But anyway, I'll just stop talking here, because we all want to hear from you. You don't want to hear from me.
No. Yeah, I mean, one thing that's over the last 2 days I've been thinking about more. I mean, you know, if I could write this paper again, it would be totally different, as always, right? But one thing that strikes me as interesting is, I mean, one thing that didn't make it into this version of the paper was, I was thinking about metaphor as, you know, I kept seeming to try and make it go away, right? It's like, it's too literal, or it's not literal enough, it's dangerous, it's facile. But as a test, and this is why, you know, all the talk about dead metaphors, and the problem with dead metaphors is the way they further limit and constrict thought. So something, the potential of the metaphor, it becomes worse than no metaphor at all, right? In some way. And like you're saying, other metaphors, which make sense, but only in a very bounded way. It's like, okay, yeah, I can see that this part of the domain maps, but this part doesn't. I'm much more interested in the possibility right now of metaphor as an opening. In other words, another thing I had in the earlier draft of the paper that didn't make it in is a Wittgenstein's ladder. So this idea of metaphor is something you throw away once it's done its work, because if you stay in it too long, the dangers start to become more dangerous. It can become a dead metaphor. It can become a reinscription of the literal in a bad way. So metaphor is a moment. You know, and this is why, you know, metaphors which you know, so that transition from metaphor to literal, some metaphors, and I'm interested in the idea that the metaphor is where that may be most productive, is where we find the hardest time imagining it, not in a facile way of like, you know, Caesar is not really orange, but in the more meaningful sense of what does it mean for music to be sex, or for music to be conscious, for music to have intentionality? Because those literalizations don't feel wrong, but they also don't feel easy. They feel uneasy, but also constantly tempting. So to me, that notion that metaphor takes you to some kind of threshold, but then what's really crucial is crossing the threshold, or thinking about why you want to cross the threshold, but you also feel impeded from crossing the threshold. So I'm, you know, almost starting to think of metaphor much in this sense as a technique more than somewhere to remain. Is, you know, and that's a change that's happened in my thinking over the last 2 days, from hearing how everybody else has framed, you know, some of exactly the same questions in more, usually much more particularistic ways.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, and I think we're getting very close to the idea of you know, the concept as a location, as a clearing, almost, if to get all Heideggerian here for a moment.
And you know, I've been thinking, like, particularly during the previous panel, and I was really glad to hear that William brought up conceptual metaphor as well, which is like how it from that. Yeah, anyway, that's a whole other thing. But you talked about it; it's not real, but at the same time, I mean, that's Eco's test of metaphoricity, right? But at the same time, Lakoff and Johnson talk about, which I find intriguing, how the bringing of a new metaphor into a cognitive system changes the reality for that cognitive system. And I think that shows, that the possible positive things of introducing new metaphors or new mappings. What if Caesar was orange? I guess no, but that mapping sort of course didn't work. But and stuff. So this has been fantastic. I really enjoyed being on this panel. Thank you. And I won't look at gardening the same. I moved to the Midwest and I have a garden now, and it's going to be a whole different story. So,
I'm just so glad that you talked about the Melvins and Mark Ribot. Yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, their cranky glory, yeah.
Oh, my goodness, yeah.
I mean,
go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, one thing that occurs to me is, obviously with Lakoff Johnson is one of those models that shows how metaphor can be. I mean, the notion of generative in the last panel was really interesting because that sense of it creates a reality. But at the same time, it's asserting there's two different domains. The difference in the domains has to be there for there to be a crossing between domains. So my concern is, how does that limit the very generative potential? Which is why can metaphor only get you so far, is what I'm thinking. Because you have to assert that the domains are different, so you're maintaining a barrier in order to cross it. And that's, I don't know exactly what I think about that, but that's the question that kept coming back to me, which motivated me to write this paper. What do you do with that?
What about the idea of the prolonged contemplation through strange metaphors coming into our thing? I mean, that all of a sudden we don't just glibly know that Caesar is an orange, but we have this prolonged contemplation. And like one of the ones I ran across was radical contingency is a useful toothbrush. I still have no idea what that means, and I'm thinking about it. So I mean, but So.
Yeah.
I like the direction of this conversation too, though, because I think it's really important to remember that metaphors aren't words. Metaphors are words in a context, or in terms of cognitive metaphor, you need these two domains. You need more than just a word. We can't just say this or that is a metaphor. We have to understand how the thing is being used and what is the crossing that's being suggested. Do we want to make that crossing, or do we want to make a different crossing? And there's some of this too. It's not always under our control or voluntary. I mean, especially in the case of cognitive metaphor, these are deeply embedded ways of thinking and perceiving reality, constructions of reality. And I think, as much as we maybe want to change metaphor, we don't always have that much power. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Right. Well, and also the one presumption that the classic cognitive metaphor theory makes is that it ignores the differences between bodies, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so that becomes an interesting, huge question. What happens when people with different embodied experiences, subtly or radically, how similar or different are their conceptual domains to start with, right?
Yeah.
All of this is great. We are coming to the end of our allotted time, but I want to give everybody else in the room a chance to raise any questions. If not, then we have another chance in our concluding general discussion. And with that, let's thank our speakers, and thanks so much for a really rich and very, very condensed short session where we covered a lot of ground. And over to Nina and Danny for our concluding plenary discussion. Thanks so much, everybody.